Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. Thought I would talk about Russia Ukraine, where the war is changing. We're well over 4 years in now. It's getting far less attention on the headlines, but for the first time in well over 2 years, we've just had a month where the Ukrainians have taken net territory back, their own territory, from Russia. In other words, the front lines are moving in the other direction. And it's not because the Ukrainians are suddenly raising far more troops. They are wildly outnumbered in general population and in troops on the ground. Rather, it's because the Ukrainians are technologically more advanced than Russia, and they're using drones. They're using unmanned vehicles. And these are battles on the ground in South and Southeast Ukraine that are basically being fought without people on the Ukrainian side, or should I say without people on the ground. Remote soldiers, absolutely, from a few miles away or even from Kyiv. But you've got the Russians with trench warfare, and then these waves of Ukrainian non-manned arms. First, groups of vehicles that are, I guess, yay big. I mean, they're significantly smaller than cars or motorcycles, and they have bombs on them, and they're remote controlled, and they're each controlled by a person. They go into a trench, and then they explode. And then after that, there's a wave of air vehicles, of drones, air drones that are aiming and blowing themselves up against any soldiers that run away or any that are moving. And then you have a third wave of unmanned vehicles that aren't bombs, but instead have weapons on them that can fire. And it is effective, and it is debilitating psychologically if you're a soldier trying to fight against that, especially because you're badly trained, badly paid, and you're not fighting for your own territory. You don't know what really the purpose is of the fight. And so we're starting to see more desertions. This is a really big deal. Also, but it's not only Ukraine, though those companies are doing extraordinary work, and they're pumping out literally millions of drones a year now. But it's also the fact that Elon Musk has shut down Starlink for Russia. And that means that they no longer have the functionality of drones with communications, the small ones, because Starlink is tiny. It's the size of a dinner plate. And instead, they have to use Russian tech, which is about as big as a kitchen table. And you can't put that on little drones that are flying. You can't put it on little vehicles. It's not efficient. In fact, at this point, most of the folks I talk to in the defense industry tell me they are about a year behind Ukraine. So this is a really big deal. Now, is this why Putin said during Victory Day celebrations, where he showed up briefly, but with all the internet shut down and with no military parade to speak of, and almost no one visiting, no dignitaries from around the world showing up to celebrate along with Putin? Is this why he said that the war might be winding down, might be almost over? I don't think so. But it is a very different dynamic between Russia and Ukraine now. The Russians, of course, their economy was looking in better shape, in part because the price that they can get for their oil, their gas, their fertilizer, all of which is being produced in Russia, all of which is really necessary around the world, given the Strait of Hormuz problems. They can get a lot more money for that. But a lot of their infrastructure is now getting blown up, and indeed, they've got well over 500,000 barrels of oil a day that's not on the market because it's been hit by Ukrainian drones. So this is a big deal. And over the last few days, we've seen, on the one hand, unprecedented strikes by Russia, long-range drones and missiles against the Ukrainians in Kyiv and elsewhere, with a lot of people getting killed on the ground. Now we're also seeing strikes by the Ukrainians, not only on critical infrastructure, but on high-end apartment complexes in and around Moscow. Now, I mean, number one, these are war crimes. I was very loud and critical when the Russians were firing at civilians without any concern about what they were hitting and why. And now that the Ukrainians are doing the same or starting to do the same in Russia, that doesn't suddenly make it okay, even though the Ukrainians have been the much weaker side and they're the ones that are invaded, but still something we need to call out. More importantly, long term, is this going to make Putin more likely to accept negotiations that could be more balanced? Would he be willing to accept a long-term ceasefire along the present lines of conflict, which the Ukrainians, they won't recognize that the Russians have taken that territory, but they were willing to accept a ceasefire as Trump pressed them. Russia said no. This might be a good time for other countries that are engaged with the Russians to give that a shot. We'll see if that goes anywhere. But the other thing, of course, is that Putin has gotten himself in a jam. He's lost well over 1 million Russian casualties, almost 400,000 Russian soldiers dead. It is not popular inside Russia. Of course, it's very hard to figure out what the Russian people really think because there is no free media. There's very little effective polling. You'll get arrested or worse if you demonstrate. And yet we're starting to see a bunch of Russian military bloggers criticize Putin for the mistakes that are being made. Some high-level former military generals that have been critical. Worth watching whether mothers, for example, of those soldiers that have been put in harm's way will start speaking aloud more often. Again, the consequences are grave. But that doesn't mean that there'll be zero courage that'll be shown by the Russian people. It's worth paying attention to. Putin is increasingly isolated. He's spending very little time with his advisors, almost no time in public. He's not traveling very much at all. He's getting older. His top advisors are less capable. He's removed some of those that were long-standing and more able to tell him what was happening around the country and the world, replaced them, for example, with a former bodyguard and close friends, and not a good outcome for a leader of one of the world's largest militaries and with the United States, the largest nuclear force. If Putin starts really failing, the potential that he would make very grave miscalculations or very grave escalations and have no one to stop him is something that I do increasingly worry about. So no, I don't think the world is heading for World War III. And I don't think that the Americans, or more importantly, the Europeans, since they're doing all the lifting for Ukraine, should be dissuaded from providing support to help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. But I do recognize that the potential of this war to go very badly, meaning knock-on consequences and big mistakes made by Putin, is growing. And I think we need to consider what that might mean for geopolitical stability in a way that I wouldn't worry about China and Xi Jinping, much more risk-averse, much more confident, doing much better long-term. And I wouldn't worry about the United States because there are far more checks and balances. There's much more transparency, much more ability for people to see what's going on. That's not the case in Russia. And I'm delighted to see the war shift in favor of the Ukrainians. I think it's a big win for Ukraine. It's a big win for democratic governance and rule of law. And despite all of the corruption and inadequacy of Ukrainian governance, that's nothing compared to what we see in Russia, of course. And it's also a big win for Europe. And if you were to make me invest long term in Europe, I would probably invest more of my own money in Ukrainian defense and AI capabilities before just about anything else in any country. And increasingly, it's the Ukrainians that are an advantage for European strength and not the other way around. The Europeans need Ukraine more long term than the Ukrainians need Europe. That's quite something to say. The United States is really barely playing a role in the war at this point. Still some intelligence, still some weapons, but most of it is coming from the Ukrainians themselves, and all the money is coming from Ukraine and from Europe, not from the United States. I think that it's unfortunate that the Americans have given up on Ukraine, but it's great to see that the Ukrainians don't need them anymore. And at the end of the day, Putin, I hope, is starting to pay attention. That's it for me, and I'll talk to you all real soon.